and welcome to Myth Monsters. My name is Erin and I'll be your host for these little snack bite-sized podcasts on folklore and mythical monsters from all around the world. These podcasts focus on the actual cryptids, folklore and mythic monsters from global mythology, rather than focusing on the full stories of heroes and their big adventures. I'll also be dropping in some references that they have to recent culture, and where you can see these represented in modern day content so that you can learn more and get as obsessed as I am about these absolute legends of the mythological world. It's our second episode of our September double feature, just caused by me being a pure mayhem magnet. Funny story, this week I went to see what I thought was a ballet, but turned out when I got to my seat was a breakdancing musical, which was better than the ballet, I am sure. But just a typical thing that I would end up doing. It's also our last episode before my big September break, and I'm very excited to recharge to give you the best Myth Monster experience for the rest of the year, but after this, I'll see you in 2 weeks. But for now, let's hop into this week's monster. This week, we're not heading anywhere specific, but we're looking at a religious monster from Jewish folklore, the epic Golem. The Golem is described as a giant creature made up of a lifeless substance, such as mud, stone, clay, or dust, to make up a humanoid shape, then brought to life through religious incantations using mostly Hebrew. They're usually described as being larger than a usual person, being about 8 to 10 feet tall, in a generic humanoid form, with Hebrew letters indented into their foreheads. Golems are usually mindless and speechless, and are put to a task by their creator, who would mould them out of the substance by hand for their use. Golems are also considered quite clumsy, but also very logical, so the instructions given to them by their creator must be very exact and without any creative interpretation. They were not able to feel emotions, empathy or aggression within folklore either, and so they were generally pretty happy obeying their master in any task. Although I say pretty happy, we assume that they were pretty happy considering they have no emotions. These monsters didn't have any specific powers other than those given naturally by the substances that they were made from. For instance, if they were made of stone, they were immensely durable and strong. If they were made out of clay, they were more malleable and able to shapeshift if needed into different shapes and sizes. Mystics who created these creatures could also give life to other inanimate objects made from these same materials, so anything that did come to life, be them humanoid or not, were also considered golems, although these were not really used in regards to the mythical monster term that we're discussing. I'm not discussing a sentient watering can, for instance. To create a golem, it was usually a mystic or kabbalist within the Jewish faith who would use the golem as an apprentice or an assistant in their work. They would gather the substance they wanted to make the golem from and create the form of it. Then they would write the true name of God either on the forehead of the golem, or they would write it on paper and put this in the golem's mouth and then dance around it. You could also write other Hebrew, such as with the letters Aleph, Mem and Tav, which spell emet, that means truth, to bring the golem to life. To destroy a golem, you would need to erase the letters on their head or remove the paper from their mouth. In the case of the letters that I just spoke to you, you would erase the Aleph, leaving the Mem and the Tav, which spells met, meaning death, and would leave the golem crumbling into pieces. You could also walk in the opposite direction of your creation dance, saying and making the order of the words backwards. That sounds really complicated. This was the only way to create and destroy a golem, and because of their reanimated state, they of course couldn't reproduce or eat. They were literally just created to live, work and die, which I suppose is pretty similar to some humans too. Of course, because of their literal nature, if you did mess up and make instructions quite ambiguous, golems would end up obeying the literal meaning. This could sometimes lead to chaos and destruction, and would leave the mystic having to destroy his creation, which did happen in most recorded cases of golems. Because of this though, they have an inherent villain stamp on them, but they didn't feel or have any emotions, meaning that they did nothing with any evil intent, and to mark them a villain would be technically incorrect. But let's hop on over to etymology. It's actually super interesting this week, because there are a few different ones. Golem is a Hebrew word meaning shapeless mass. But in the Talmud, one of the Jewish texts, the word is used as unformed or imperfect. Interestingly, the text also refers to Adam, the first man, as a golem for the first 12 hours of his life, and referred to the meaning as body without a soul. So long story short, golem literally means shapeless mass, but can also be used for imperfect, body without a soul, and unformed too, which I think is pretty cool. Either way though, it's a Hebrew word. What is quite funny, and lasts outside of the Jewish faith, is that someone who is large, but is also dumb, can be called a golem, and I plan on using that on my dad at some point in my life. The golem's history goes all the way back to early Judaism, which dates all the way back to 600 BC, and is written about in the Talmud, which I mentioned in that etymology section. And in this, the first mention of them is with Adam, who was described as that golem of body without a soul when he came into being, as he was initially dust and then kneaded into a shapeless husk, and initially couldn't speak either. However, the earliest mention of forming a golem was within the Book of Formation, which is a book on Jewish mysticism, but we're not entirely sure when this was written, and it was a little bit vague. This was followed up by the Sodai Razaya, another book written by a Kabbalist in the 12th or 13th centuries, describing the full process of creating a golem and getting it to work with you in actual detail that people could follow. The oldest story of golems, though, comes from a Polish Kabbalist from 1630 to 1650, who reported the creation of a golem by Rabbi Eliyahu, who was the rabbi of Kelm in Poland between 1550 and 1583. It was written in this text that the rabbi had created a golem, and I actually have an extract for you. And I have heard in a certain and explicit way from several respectable persons that one man living close to our time, whose name is R. Eliyahu, the master of the name, who made a creature out of matter and form, and it performed hard work for him for a long period, and the name of Emet was hanging upon his neck until he finally removed it for a certain reason, the name from his neck, and it returned to dust. With this specific golem as well, it actually grew larger and larger with each task that it did, and the rabbi feared that it would destroy the universe. Therefore, he destroyed it, and the golem injured him when it fell, causing him to have a large scar on his face for the rest of his life, to remind him not to mess with the powers of life. The most famous golem story, though, is that of the Golem of Prague. Another rabbi, Rabbi Lowe, created a golem out of the clay from the banks of the Vltava River. The story goes that Rudolf II, the Holy Roman Emperor, was expelling or killing the Jewish community throughout Poland, and so Rabbi Lowe created the golem to defend the Polish ghetto from anti-Semitic attacks and pogroms. The golem was called Yosef and was able to make himself invisible and summon dead spirits. Lowe would actually deactivate the golem every Friday evening before Sabbath, and so that it would rest along with everyone else. However, one Friday he forgot. Now there are two tellings on what happened on that fateful Saturday, but both end in murder. In one, the golem falls in love, but is then rejected and goes on a murderous rampage. And the other one tells us that the golem just goes on the same murderous rampage without the whole falling in love bit. The rabbi manages to pull the shem, or the paper with God's name on, from the golem's mouth in front of a synagogue, and Yosef, of course, then fell to pieces. His body was stored in the attic of the synagogue and eventually rebuilt, ready to be reused if needed. Rabbi Lowe forbade anyone from going up into the attic, and eventually one of his successors braved going up after a day of religious preparation. And at the very top of the stairs, he ran back down, terrified, re-shouting the warning from Rabbi Lowe once again. According to legend, the golem is still in that synagogue's attic. However, this was checked out in 1883, and there was no sign of any golem up there. Some tales tell that it was stolen and buried where the Zizkov television tower now stands in Prague. And a more recent legend tells that a Nazi agent was killed by Yosef when breaking into the attic when storming the synagogue during World War II. The golem is a representation of a blessing and a curse, and that sometimes the power to create life should remain in the hands of the maker. They are often linked to villainy, as I mentioned earlier, because of this, as life is only gifted in religion from either God or the devil. And unfortunately, due to anti-Semitism during the time of the golem's introduction into folklore, it means that they very often got linked to the devil and negativity. However, just based on the Golem of Prague story, you can see that they were mainly portrayed in a positive way within the Jewish faith itself, and could even be considered a hero in this story. There's a really cool other mythical comparison to this with the clay boy from Yiddish and Slavic folklore, which is a golem and gingerbread man crossover. This monster is created to serve as a solution for infertility and creating your own child, usually with disastrous endings. Unfortunately, there's not much else on this, so I most likely won't be able to cover it in their own episode. So I'm sorry, this is all I got on that one. The other mythical comparison that I can think of is actually man itself within Greek mythology. In Greek mythos, man was created from clay by Prometheus, the son of the god king Zeus, and breathed life into by Athena, goddess of wisdom. Prometheus then decided to give humans the gift of fire, and Zeus was generally quite annoyed at that, so decided to punish him for the rest of time by sticking him to a rock with an eagle eating his regenerative liver forever. But they kind of sound golemish, right? Maybe we're all golems, really. And poor Prometheus. Now, let's hop on over to modern media. Golems are actually really prevalent within media, so we have a load this week that I'm super excited to tell you about. For art, portrait-wise, have a look at Rabbi Lowe and the Golem by Mikolas Alez from 1899, and The Golem Prague Fantasies by Hugo Steiner Prague from 1916, or lastly, the movie poster from Der Golem from 1920 is pretty cool as well. Otherwise, independent art is pretty good for this monster, so go check those out too. You can actually see a real golem at Madame Tussauds in Prague, which was made for the Der Golem film back in 1920, and is pretty cool. You can also get little figurines of handmade ones at certain tourist attractions throughout Germany, Poland and the Czech Republic if you wanted your own mini one. In movies, we have The Limehouse Golem, The Golem and the Dancing Girl, Der Golem, An American Tale, The Golem, 1915 and 2018, The Scorpion King, Golem, The Keep, It, Inglourious Bastards, Daimajin, Atlantis the Lost Empire, The Real Schmiel, and Emperor and the Golem. There's a lot of golems in there. For TV, we have The Simpsons, Extreme Ghostbusters, The Magicians, Batman Beyond, Gargoyles, The Sopranos, Huntic, Secrets and Seekers, King Arthur and the Knights of Justice, Legend Quest, The X-Files, Supernatural, The Jews Are Coming, The Order, Super Sentai Power Rangers, Grimm, Berserk, Digimon, Fairy Tail, Broken Blade, Legacies, Monster Soul and Delicious in Dungeon. In video games we have ones such as World of Warcraft, Time Splitters 2, Mother 3, Path of Exile, Neverwinter Nights, Legend of Mana, Fallen London, Elemental War of Magic, Castlevania, Dark Souls, Ancient Empires, Devil May Cry 2, Warcraft 3, Baldur's Gate, Child of Light, Ancient Domains of Mystery, Final Fantasy, Guild Wars, Fate/Grand Order, Disgaea, Minecraft, NetHack, Metroid Prime, Diablo 2, Might and Magic, Last Armageddon, Dragon's Dogma, Dragon Age, Legend of Zelda, Elder Scrolls, Dragon Quest, Kingdom of Loathing, Pokemon, Sonic the Hedgehog, Spyro the Dragon, Terraria, the Soul series, and The Witcher. My book recommendation this week is for The Golem, A Man Made of Mud by Shamel Eres-Samson for more on this specific monster. And if you have little ones who want to learn more about this one, there's also Too Many Golems by Jane Yolen and Maya Schleifer. Now it's time for Do I Think They Existed? Do I think they physically existed? Yes, more than likely I think someone has created a giant clay bloke and attempted to do a Frankenstein number on it. However, do I think the spiritual entity exists? Probably not. Hear me out though, I get that there's magic involved here, and that is inherently the problem. I'm not a part of any main religions, but I do feel like the power to give life is inherently playing God, and I don't think any powers that be would allow us as humans to just pick and choose what we give life to, bar obviously pregnancy. This is what makes Mary Shelley's Frankenstein so much fun. Sci-fi power, and this just does not work in reality. Yes, you can get a frog to move its legs after death with electricity, but there's not much evidence that you can bring inanimate things to life, I'm afraid. As much as I would love to have a mini golem do my dishes for me and shout, "It's alive!" as it comes into consciousness, I truly do want to be young Frankenstein. I do love this monster though, and I think the whole good versus evil argument here is really good too, and it's super unique to this monster that has these two sides to it depending on if you're part of the faith it comes from or not. But what do you think? Did golems run amok after their hectic creation? Let me know on Twitter, I would love to know what you think about this one. But it is a legendary monster this week that I'm so glad we got to cover, and one that I misjudged as much more of a boring monster than I thought. So I enjoyed learning about this one, and I hope you did too. I also hope that it may have reshaped your opinion on whether it was a villainous creature or not. I think it is so much more complex than that, and it's been a real joy to look at and dive into. Now I'm off for the next 2 weeks for my annual September break, and I am grateful for you all for bearing with me, and I need a little bit of TLC to recover from my horrendous burnout which is persisting. It's been a really busy year, and I've had a lot of mini breaks and late published episodes recently, so thank you for bearing with me. But because of this, hopefully this gives me some time to catch up and refresh for you all for the rest of the year. So, we'll be back on Thursday the 3rd of October, and we're heading to all of the Spanish-speaking nations across the world for a variety of naughty, but sometimes helpful and fun household creatures, the duende. Get ready for some mischief when we're back with these little monsters on the 4th of October. I can't wait to see you all again. For now though, thank you so much for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure as always. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a rating on the service you are listening on. I've got the Twitter for any questions or suggestions on what monsters to cover next. and I'd really love to hear from you. The social media handles for TikTok, YouTube, Threads and Instagram are Myth Monsters Podcast, and the Twitter is Myth Monsters Pod. But all of our content can be found at mythmonsters.co.uk, including some very cool merchandise too. You can also find us on Good Pods, Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon if you want to help me fund the podcast too. Come join the fun though, share this with your pals, they might love me as much as you do. But for now, stay spooky, and I'll see you in 2 weeks, babes.